Our speaker tonight is Bill Radke, and I have a question for you. Who thinks San Bernardino is in California? Yeah, I did too. Bill has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 1983. Doesn't look that old. At a variety of refuges in Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, and Arizona, and he currently serves as the refuge manager for the San Bernardino and Leslie Canyon National Wildlife Refuges here in the state. I'm eager to hear about him. That's the corner, way in the south corner of the state that I don't get to too often. Bill's an Arizona native. He grew up in Phoenix, went to school at the University of Arizona. He's been married 35 years and has 2 daughters who are presently attending our very own Prescott College. Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It really is wonderful to be here and celebrate the beginning of autumn today. What a nice day. Yeah, it rained. We didn't in southeast Arizona. We had sunny skies today, no clouds even. So it's nice to be up here. We're going to dive in, okay? So I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's different from the Arizona Game and Fish Department in the following ways. Arizona Game and Fish Department is the state agency, and they tend to focus their management on resident wildlife and fish. So if you're a mule deer, or if you're a Gambel's quail, or if you're a javelina, those are the animals that Arizona Game and Fish Department focuses management on. Whereas the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who I work for, is a national organization who deals with the wildlife that doesn't stay put, that moves around, which includes migratory birds. They don't stay put typically in just one state. They're flying across multiple states, sometimes multiple nations. And then we deal with anadromous fish. So if you're a salmon, you don't stay in one state either to be managed by the state of Washington or Oregon or California. You may be moving through multiple states and then into the ocean. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it administers the congressionally mandated Federal Endangered Species Act. So those are some of the differences between the state and the federal wildlife management agencies. Obviously, we work very closely together on a number of things. This is a mission statement for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can probably read it as well as I can. Better, in fact, because you're looking at the screen. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers nationwide over 560 different national wildlife refuges. 9 of those are here in Arizona, and 2 of those in this corner of the state in Cochise County are the 2 that I'm going to focus on tonight. Those are the ones that I'm fortunate enough to work at. San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge is a small refuge. Both of these are small refuges acreage-wise. It's a 2,300 acre refuge. And Leslie Canyon Wildlife Refuge is a little bigger. It's 2,700 acres. So together, these 2 refuges are only about 5,000 acres of federal land here in the United States. But there's a lot of stuff crammed into that 5,000 acres. Every national wildlife refuge has a specific enabling purpose. And San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge and Leslie Canyon Wildlife Refuge are endangered species refuges. They were created specifically to manage threatened and endangered species, to protect and help the recovery of threatened and endangered species. We have, on those 2 refuges alone, 38 different species that are imperiled either state or federally. So there's a lot of rare species crammed into that area. Some of those are the lesser long-nosed bat. There's a Cochise pincushion cactus. There's a Chiricahua leopard frog. You probably thought this was ryegrass, but it's not. It's Huachuca water umbel, a wetland plant. And this little spot right smack in the middle is my index finger with a federally listed threatened San Bernardino spring snail sitting on the middle of it. So that's non-charismatic microfauna. You can imagine that any desert area that has wetlands in it was a real attraction, not only to the wildlife, right, but to people for thousands of years too. And the refuges protect a lot of cultural resources. There's Clovis sites on the refuge. The Coronado expedition in 1540 came through that general area and actually had a huge encampment for a period of time north of Leslie Canyon Wildlife Refuge. The Apaches showed up in this country, in that part of the country, about 1600 or so, and you can see one of the early field guides here, where they were painting bird ID stuff in the caves there. And then Anglos kind of showed up in this area in the 1800s. In 1884, there was a fellow named John Slaughter, and he came from Texas. He was a Texas Ranger, and he migrated west like a lot of people do. And he settled in the San Bernardino Valley and purchased a Spanish land grant, a huge area, which now is in part Mexico and in part Arizona. And the Slaughter Ranch is a National Historical Site that's been restored, and the refuge has a conservation easement on that property. So a lot of people go to see the human history of Slaughter Ranch and then pick up on the natural history at the same time. Some people do it the other way. The reason that this is such a neat refuge to have worked at for the last 16 years is because of the biodiversity there. You have the Rocky Mountains coming down from the north, and you have the Sierra Madre reaching up from the south, and they meet right there at the Arizona-Sonora border. And then you have Sonoran Desert creeping over from Tucson, and you have the Chihuahuan Desert creeping over from El Paso, and they kind of meet right at that area too. You have some Great Plains influences there. So you have this huge variety of habitats. What you also have is elevational habitats. So you can stand in the valley and be at 3,000 feet elevation, and you're looking right up the hillside, right up the mountain, to mountains that are nearly 10,000 feet tall. And so that huge variety of life zones supports this tremendous diversity of fish and wildlife and bugs and plants. It's a great place to be. So some of that diversity I have pictures of. And the refuges were specifically created for fish. They're fish refuges. There aren't very many national wildlife refuges that were established specifically for fish, but these are the federally listed endangered or threatened fish. This is a yaqui top minnow. It's about the size of a guppy. The males are black like this with orange fins and spend their time chasing the females. There's a yaqui chub, which is kind of a 5-inch long fish, sardine-sized fish. I don't know if they taste like sardines, but that's the size they are. This is a yaqui beautiful shiner, which is also another small fish, very colorful fish. That's how it got the name. And guess what kind of catfish this is? See, you already know your fish. So it's a yaqui catfish, which is the only catfish native to the west side of the Continental Divide. So these all have the name Yaqui associated with them because the Rio Yaqui headwaters, in part, are in a little corner of Arizona. So it's a huge river. We don't hear about it much because it's 98% in Mexico. But it flows ultimately into the ocean near Hermosillo, and it drains the Sierra Madre. There's a bunch of rivers that come together to form the Rio Yaqui. 2% of that watershed is in the United States, the headwaters, and that's where the refuges are. They're at the headwaters of the Rio Yaqui. That tremendous biodiversity really reflects itself in the plants that are there. There's 700 different kinds of plants there. And I don't know if you can read these well enough. This is a beautiful little plant called Arizona blue curl, Mexican yellow show. This is blue grama. It's one of almost 80 different kinds of grasses that grow on the refuge. So it's a beautiful desert grassland area. We have the classic desert stuff that you might expect, ocotillo. But then because we have the wetlands there, we have these really unique, again, a federally listed endangered plant, Huachuca water umbel, which has these tiny flowers, maybe 2 millimeters wide. So you got to get down on your hands and knees to see the flowers. And then this desert hibiscus. Hibiscus we think of as a plant, that would be growing in San Diego or Hawaii. But the tropical influence there in the San Bernardino Valley supports a number of hibiscus flowers too. So we have all these neat invertebrates that live in this part of the world. Some of those are the dragonflies. This is a giant darner, which is the biggest dragonfly in the United States. It's about 6 inches long, sometimes longer. Could almost carry you off, right? And painted grasshopper, aptly named. It's a wingless grasshopper, or I should say flightless, because you can see it does have short little wings. It's brightly colored because it's a nasty tasting grasshopper. And if you're a color vision animal like a bird, you learn to avoid eating painted grasshoppers. They feed on a euphorbed type of a plant, a castor bean, so something that makes them taste bad. This is called a unicorn mantis. I don't think anybody knows why it has that little point on the head like that, but it's unique and gives it its name. This is a talus snail, Leslie Canyon talus snail, the only place this animal is known from. It's a pretty little snail that comes out during the rainy season, and the shell is about the size of a nickel, so it's another gigantic animal, right? The butterfly diversity in Cochise County, where the refuges are located, is among the highest, if not the highest, number of butterflies in any county in the United States. And some of those really unique butterflies there's a black checker spot. There's a type of skipper called a dull fire tip. And this is a real pretty butterfly. It's kind of this school bus yellow when it opens its wings, called a tailed sulfur. So one of the remarkable things about the San Bernardino Valley is the species richness of native bees. We don't think about native bees all that much. We think about honeybees, and we hear that bees things aren't good for bees, or pollinators in general. The San Bernardino Valley has at least 550 different kinds of native bees. That's a lot of bees. In fact, it is the highest number in a concentrated area of native bees known anywhere in the entire world, is in the San Bernardino Valley. So read that on a Snapple cap sometime. We have a tremendous diversity of reptiles and amphibians. 56 different kinds of reptiles and amphibians are on the refuges there alone. Things like a Texas horn lizard. The snake is a green rat snake. Gila monster, and the coral snake, Arizona coral snake. You know how to tell it apart from the king snakes you have here around Prescott? Yeah, the order of the colors. The two bright colors are together on the coral snake, and they're separated in the king snake. That's one way. They look very different to me. These bands go all the way around the body. They look almost painted on. It's a beautiful little snake. It is deadly, of course, so there's that. We have this tremendous diversity of mammals, too. 67 different kinds of mammals are crowded into that. Just on those two refuges, we have those. A lot of those are bats, which are migratory. But we have such diversity. We have the javelina, the mule deer. There's actually 2 mule deer here. There's another one here. We do. We have the white-tailed deer there, the small little coos deer. The smallest mammal we have is this shrew. It's Cochran's shrew. It was split out from desert shrew. It weighs about as much as a penny, and and was the type locality, the place it was discovered was Leslie Canyon National Wildlife Refuge. And then we have mountain lions too. We have real common animals that you don't necessarily see because they're nocturnal, like the hognose skunk, white-backed hognose skunk, which is real badger-like. You can see his gigantic claws on him and kind of a bare nose, and he kind of fills a badger niche a little bit, except he's a skunk. And then we have rare animals in that area also. Cochise County supports ocelots, and jaguars have been photographed. This was a jaguar photographed by Warner Glenn in the Peloncillo Mountains just east of San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge. And then birds, right? This is Audubon Society. So 337 different kinds of birds. That changes periodically when someone sees a new one. When you all come down and see a new one, then we have to change the list. But so I brought pictures of some of those. I didn't have pictures of all 337 of them, so I didn't bring that many. The truth is that a lot of people are, the vast majority of our visitation is birders. They're our biggest user group coming down. This particular group came down a few years ago to see a blue mockingbird, which is a Mexican species. It was on the refuge for more than 2 months. The hard part about coming to Prescott and talking about birds is trying to show you something different that you don't already have here. As you explained, the Central Highlands have tremendous diversity of habitats, and the Mogollon Rim that shoots through here carries a lot of the same birds that we have in southeast Arizona. So again, it's hard to find something that you don't already have. But so forgive me. For example, I know that we get all excited when we see rufous hummingbirds because they kind of migrate through. There's a lot of them down there right now. But we know that you have them up here all the time. They probably nest up here, right? So, no. And we get real excited in the winter when we have black-chinned sparrows. They don't have black chins in the winter. But so this is what they look like when they come to our part, usually. And then I come up here and walk through the forest, and you hear them singing all around you. So I can't really show you that one either. So forgive me. Some of the pictures are going to be things that you can see regularly around here, and then some of them hopefully will be different. The wetlands on the refuge are again unique for the desert. So we have neat things like pied-billed grebes that eat bullfrogs. So I know you've seen pied-billed grebes, but I bet you haven't seen a pied-billed grebe hogging down a small bullfrog before. So that's a little different. I know you have mallards up here, but our mallards don't have green heads down there. They call them Mexican ducks. And there's a male Mexican duck, is what they look like. And so that's again, it's a Mexican species that really genetically isn't the same thing as a mallard. They'll split it out one of these days formally, and you can count a new bird if you've seen one of these. One of our neat wetland birds are green kingfishers. And they're smaller than your kingfishers up here, half that size probably. They're green, and that red band is flipped on the sexes. So this is a male that has the orange on it. The reason we have green kingfishers is because we have endangered fish. And they come and weed out the dumb endangered fish, right? So this one's hogging down a top minnow. We have about a dozen different kinds of hummingbirds, and so that's a challenge to try to see them all, on the same trip or whatever. One of the common ones, one of them that nests at Leslie Canyon, is the broad-billed hummingbird. And then one of them that is more rare is a violet-crowned hummingbird, a bigger hummingbird, brown on the back and white on the front, real pretty bird. Some of these birds are nesting birds, like I said. The broad-billed hummingbird, like this female, is a nesting species there. We have Lucifer hummingbirds. Don't have a picture. So I know you have blackhawks. You have more blackhawks than we do, I'm pretty sure. I see your Blackhawks up here hogging down crayfish and things like that. But you probably haven't seen a Blackhawk hogging down a white-winged dove. So, you read about Blackhawks and it says, may occasionally take birds or something. That was based on one that somebody saw take a bird in the 1800s, eat a towhee. But one of my daughters and I saw this Blackhawk come stooping down and just snatched up this white-winged dove. He was so surprised he wasn't really sure how to kill it or what to do with it, but he carried it around for a long time trying. One of the more common hawks down there actually is a gray hawk. We have gray hawks at San Bernardino Refuge, rarely at Leslie Canyon, and then they're very common on the San Pedro River. They're a smaller hawk than a red tail or a Swainson's hawk, and you hear them and see them in the cottonwoods, but they actually feed in the mesquites adjacent to the cottonwoods. They're lizard specialists, so they're hunting lizards primarily. Doesn't mean they don't eat other things. Just like crayfish eaters sometimes try a white-winged dove, but these guys are going mostly for lizards. We have thrashers. You probably see some of these here too. Crystal thrasher is the one with the red and the mallard stripe. And then the Bendire's thrasher is a shorter-billed thrasher with a bright yellow eye. Thrashers, especially the crystal thrasher, is a bird that really nests early. So they're there probably every day of the year, but they get quiet about the time the birders show up. They're really singing away and nesting and on territories more in January and February. You've seen that one? Northern beardless Tyrannulette is a good one to get. They have a real unique call. A lot of times that's the best way to find them, is to hear them and then seek them out. They're a little flycatcher-like bird. Have that crest. This one has a little band on its leg. We do have a bird banding program there. So that's one of them that we've held in our hand. Some of the real flycatchers that we have include the vermilion flycatcher, that's the red one, and then the tropical kingbird. Tropical kingbird looks a lot like the other kingbirds, but has a thicker bill. It has this really deeply notched tail, and it has a completely different noise from a western kingbird or a Cassin's kingbird. Likes to nest in a tree near a big body of water, a ponded area. One of the neat birds we have at Leslie Canyon is a black-capped gnatcatcher. And this is a hard bird to get in Arizona. A little easier in Mexico. The female doesn't have a black cap. Has a lot of white under the tail. Has a longer bill than the other gnatcatchers. Makes a different noise, again, than the other gnatcatchers. Speaks a different language. The male has that black cap. And that's a nesting bird at Leslie Canyon. A couple more birds. Pyroloxia is a cardinal-like bird. We do have cardinals too. It's kind of nice to see the Pyroloxias. They lay like kind of mesquite areas more, and not so much the riparian areas like the cardinals do. And then we have these meadowlarks, which the books still call them eastern meadowlarks, but they're a Mexican variety of meadowlark that is a Lillian's meadowlark. And so if you're down there and you're hearing a completely different meadowlark call that sounds more like an eastern than a western, it's probably a Lillian's meadowlark. They have a lot more white on the tail, and again, they have a different voice. Mexican bird. One of the neat things that you get here that we get down there too are the monsoonal storms coming in. Usually around the beginning of July is when they hit us down there. We actually do get those every year. They're pretty predictable. And it's one of those where you can see it raining everywhere but where you are usually, and you can chase after it and see what the effects are. That's when we get our flooding, and that's really things green up. It's a second spring down there. Everything greens up, and there's a lot of species that are keyed into that monsoon time to do their breeding. And some of those include the yellow-billed cuckoo, which doesn't really show up from Mexico until June, sometimes late June, and nests there in July. It's a pretty big bird, but it comes to feast on cicadas and tent caterpillars and other insects that are in abundance because of the monsoons. Another good one is varied bunting. Now these show up a little earlier in the year than the cuckoos, but they wait until the monsoons to start breeding. So they don't really get after it until about July is when they start singing. Real colorful, beautiful bird. And then we have these sparrows, which are always a challenge. There's a Cassin sparrow. Cassin sparrows have kind of a unique pattern of spots, gives them kind of this scaly look on their back. And although these pictures, neither one of them show it the way they're tilted, they have kind of a barred pattern on their inner tail feathers, which separate them from the boterized sparrow, which has a plain brown tail on the back like this. And they both have this little yellow kind of allula on the front of the little crook of the wing, but they have a completely different voices. The boterized sparrow sounds a lot like a black-chinned sparrow, that bouncy ball kind of a noise. In fact, you'll be out there and you'll hear that and you'll think, well, this isn't black-chinned sparrow habitat. That's what you would all say. Just like when I come up here, it's like, well, this isn't boterized sparrow habitat. Then I realize that what I'm hearing. The refuges have had these show up. We have the trogons, and we have had rufous-backed robins, and we get elf owls that pop in and out. But you can't count on them. They're in adjacent areas, and they just show up occasionally, just like birds do. One of the neat things about that part of the world, as I already explained, is that you can be at whatever elevation you want, and if you want to change it and see something different, you just go up or down elevation. And by doing that, you can get into the oaks, and you can see things like Arizona woodpeckers and Mexican jays and yellow-eyed juncos. You can see whiskered screech owls pretty easily in the oak foothills in that part of the country. You go to a higher elevation and you can get flame-colored tanagers and some of these neat things. So we don't just look at birds on the National Wildlife Refuges. That's not really my job. That's a spin-off benefit of working there. But we actually do manage habitat for fish and wildlife. And one of the projects that we are continually involved with is just grassland restoration. And of course we're doing that habitat work to benefit species like scaled quail or boterized sparrow or that Lillian's meadowlark. And this is the goal. It's not to remove every tree in the grassland, but grassland areas down there have been invaded by mesquite. And so there's an area that's been treated. Here's an area that had not been treated at the time. And mesquite has its variety of species too, but the grasslands are disappearing or being altered, and so we're trying to get that back to a little more better balanced situation. And sometimes that's mechanical, and often it's maintained with prescribed fire. Wetland restoration and management is a big part of our job also. And we're doing that for species like water umbel, like the kingfisher. There's female, doesn't have the orange. And this is a sucker. What kind of sucker do you think that might be? It is. There's a fish expert in the front row. It's a yaki sucker. Good job. This is a picture taken of Rio San Bernardino, black draw, in the 1960s. And it was kind of a dry river channel. And the refuge was established in the 80s, and they did erosion control work, which allowed cottonwoods to start growing. And instead of being scoured out by annual floods during the monsoon season, they could take root. Now, that's quite a thicket of cottonwoods, and a lot of those trees ultimately were bug killed and fell down, and that really added to the system. This is what the system looks like today compared to the 1960s. Pretty nice riparian area. These are the kind of erosion control work that we do. It's not a dam, it's just a rock basically that's held together in these cages, and it catches the sediment, lets the water through, and the sediment that's held behind these gabions, they're called, it's like a big sponge. It holds water for a longer period of time, supports riparian growth. These are pole plantings where we actually took cottonwood tree limbs and stuck them into the ground, and then if you do that at the right time of the year and they're tasting water, they'll survive and grow. And eventually you have these nice riparian areas which benefit wildlife, cuckoos, and other species. So you're thinking, all right, Radke, you already told us that only 2% of the real yaqui is in the United States, so the other 90%, 98% should be doing great, right? So why do we even manage this 2%? Well, this is the real yaqui in Mexico, but increasingly that's changing. And so, this is also the real yaqui in Mexico, central Sonora. And so Mexico, like the United States, has altered those habitats for fish. If you're any of those yaqui fish species, you're not adapted to a lake environment, and so your habitat is now gone. So we still have those headwaters that we can manage for these species that, if we do things right, benefit, your pumping species into Sonora, where they can survive in different habitats there. It's the headwaters that we really have here in the United States that are so important, the springs that are bubbling up that support a lot of endemic invertebrates and the fish. Fish and Wildlife Service is involved in a lot of activities. This is a monitoring activity. There's Marcia, there's my wife. So we take volunteers, put them in the water with nets, and we talk to groups just like I'm doing here today. This group is a little younger crowd. And we do law enforcement. We're on the border, but even refugees that aren't on the border have a law enforcement presence to keep visitors and staff and the resources safe. And then we do a lot of different kinds of research activities. We support research from researchers from universities, and we do some ourselves. One of those is with this little rare cactus, the Cochise pincushion cactus. Now, this is a tiny cactus. It's about the size of one's thumb, and it's only found in the whole world in some habitats on private property that are adjacent to San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge. And one of the threats potentially was we didn't know what pollinated that cactus, and so now we do know. We've been looking at this for a few years, and it turns out that it's this guy. It's a rare cactus-loving bee that doesn't have a common name. It's called Macroptera parkeri, and it's a tiny bee. It's just about 1/8 of an inch or 2/8 of an inch large. So there's a rare bee that pollinates that rare cactus. There's another thing that we were learning about is green rat snakes. Green rat snakes were thought to be an arboreal species. They're green and they're kind of long, and you don't see them, so it was thought that they probably hang out in the trees. But it turns out that they use this kind of habitat. They use rocky habitat, and they live in little interstitial spaces in those rocks, and you rarely see them unless they happen to be crossing the road in the riparian area that you happen to be driving in. And so the baby green rat snakes look completely different from the adults, and this is what my hand looks like if a green rat snake grabs me before I grab it, because they do bite you. We opportunistically are learning about Gila monsters too. Gila monster, as it turns out, is a pretty lethargic animal. It spends over 90% of its time in a hole, inactive during the year. So you all know people like that probably too. But the Gila monster only comes out a little bit in the spring and then in the rainy season, and looking for food or looking to breed. And so we would opportunistically find a Gila monster. We would chip it, put a little pit tag in it. People chip their dogs sometimes, if you know what I'm talking about. It's a little thing about the size of a grain of rice. It's its own little number. Now you can't track it like you see on TV, tracking something. But if we find that Gila monster again, we can scan it with a little wand, and then we know for sure exactly which one it is, and we know how much it's grown, and we know where it's traveled from and to. And it has helped us with multiple captures of the same one over the last many years, that we know where some of them live. And there's a female that has a specific hole that she resides in on San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge. I think one of the best things that we do is working with others, just like I said at the beginning, where we work closely with Arizona Game and Fish Department. And you saw our mission statement, and what did it say? It says, work with others to conserve and protect and restore and enhance. And we really take that to heart. We're small refuges, but we partner with others to do big things. Some of the refuge is in the midst of a huge landscape. We don't have all the controls over the management or over water or over the influences over the refuge, so it makes sense to work with your partners. Sometimes the animals aren't on the refuge. This is on his fingertip. If you have really good eyes, you can see it. None of you can, though, because I can't either. But there's a San Bernardino spring snail on Harvey Fink's finger right there. He's the owner of the Slaughter Ranch, and that's the only place where these snails occur in the U.S. So it makes sense to work collaboratively with that guy to manage this endangered animal on his property. This is the Barboot Ranch, which is a ranch owned by Valere Austin, and it's a beautiful grassland area, and we're working closely with her. We have a conservation easement on that property. We do a lot of erosion control work, brush control. It's a really important ranch for grassland birds, for sparrows in the wintertime. This is Joe Austin at El Coronado Ranch. And we have a habitat conservation plan, safe harbor agreement, and other agreements to manage endangered fish on wetlands on that private property. One of our biggest and best partners is the Malapai Borderlands Group. And this group of ranchers have come together and organized themselves and support conservation on about 1 million acres in Arizona and in part of the Boot Heel of New Mexico. There was an article about Malapai Borderlands Group with Warner Glenn. He's the guy that took the jaguar picture that I showed you earlier. He's on the cover of Nature Conservancy about a year ago. So if any of you have that Nature Conservancy magazine, that's about the partnership that we have with the Malapai Borderlands Group. It gives us opportunities to deal with things that are not necessarily on the refuge. The Cochise pincushion cactus, those are the fruits on it after the pollinator does its job and gets those flowers pollinated. And riparian areas that otherwise are not on protected property, they're on private property. And migratory birds. Most of these are green-winged teal. But we get to have a larger influences on the landscape, working with others. Sounds pretty cheerful, right? So not everything is perfect. I'd love to say that it was, but we do have problems too. We have problems with non-native or exotic species. So one of the plants is Malta star thistle. Guess where that came from? Malta, right? And so that's a plant that is an invasive plant if we don't control it. Bullfrogs are not native to Arizona, and bullfrogs eat other frogs, so they can eliminate populations of native species. This one's eating a duck. We have Asian tapeworm that came over with carp, with Asian carp, and is in a lot of waters throughout the United States now, and impacts yaki chub, for example. And then we have things that you can't even see, funguses, chytrid fungus, which is a deadly fungus that can kill amphibians. These are Chiricahua leopard frogs, a rare species, that are doing their part to stay off the endangered species list forever. But the chytrid fungus can kill these, especially in the wintertime when temperatures drop down. And then we have border issues. I was talking to some of you before the meeting about the impacts of living right next to Mexico. Our border of San Bernardino Refuge is on the Mexican border. So we do have a certain share of drug smuggling. This is marijuana bail, and these are illegal immigrants that were coming through. There's a bar now. That's our surveillance system, you know. But the truth is that we work very closely with Border Patrol. So there's Border Patrol, here's us. There's Border Patrol loading these guys up, here's us that caught them. And so the idea is that if you can work together on national security issues, just makes sense. You're protecting the habitat, protecting the species, protecting staff, protecting visitors. We have very little problem now. During fiscal year, so the last 11 months of the year, there was one drug bust, and that was a year ago compares to 3. So it's not a daily occurrence by any means, but it's still something that we want to try to get down to 0, obviously. And as far as illegal immigrants, the average for over the last 12 or 11 months was 0.25 people per day. Now, we don't really get a quarter of a person coming through the refuge each day, but we do get, periodically a group of 12 or 20 people that are coming north, and they'll use that corridor through the refuge. And they typically get caught. Border Patrol has put a vehicle barrier on the border that is wildlife permeable. It's not the wall that you hear about or see about. And they do have a pretty good surveillance tower off refuge, but on the north side of the refuge, which is a wonderful deterrent and helps catch people. So we've really learned to work together with the Department of Homeland Security instead of being at odds with them over this issue. So things are still pretty good. We do a lot to help support the fish and the wildlife that are there. We're not there for the fish and wildlife. We're there for the public. We're providing the fish and wildlife for the public. So we have things like mountain lions and things like Mexican long-tongued bats, and there's your Coues deer. There's your Mexican ducks. It's kind of like the ark a little bit. Everything's in their little pairs, right? Well, not the osprey. But we do have just this tremendous variety. I would encourage you to try to come down if you haven't been there. If you get a chance. Hey, I got here in 5 hours today, so I know that there's that blight called Phoenix that's in between, but if you can get through that, you can see some neat things: black vultures, viceroys, Harris hawks, Apache scorpions. So who cares? Well, it turns out that birders like you care. Again, our biggest user group are birders. Aside from that, who cares? Well, you have to realize that if you're here, you took time to come here, probably. Maybe somebody got dragged here. You know who you are. The truth is that you have to realize that there's a whole group outside of us that honestly, so long as they have, a source of water and a roof over their heads and excellent television reception, they don't really care about fish and wildlife, or whether fish and wildlife occur naturally, or whether they can perpetuate themselves in this world. And I do think that it's our job to, not only my job, who gets paid by all of you to do it, but it's all of our job to really emphasize to people, to let them know that everything in this world is connected. You look at that, these analogies like the spider web. Well, how many strands can you lose before the web collapses? Or the bicycle, how many spokes can you cut and before the wheel just doesn't work anymore? And I think those analogies are pretty good ones. When you think about our natural world, there's some redundancy, luckily, in it. And then there's some things that maybe are for show. And then maybe there's those things that are very crucial. And we don't know enough about any of these things that we've studied or that we think we know so much about to know what we can discard so readily and do without. And so the message is that all of us are totally dependent on this earth. And it's our duty to take care of it as best as we can. So that's what we're doing at San Bernardino and Leslie Canyon. They're fish refuges, but they're for all these other animals, and they're for people too. And again, I encourage you to come visit us if you get a chance. And thank you very much for letting me come and visit with you tonight. Thank you. So rumor has it that I can take questions. Now, I can take them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have breeding records of the green kingfishers?
So the question was, do we have, I was going to completely revise what you said just to screw with you, but I won't. But it was a temptation, I got to admit. Do green kingfishers breed at San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge? We haven't documented them breeding there, but I'm convinced that they breed in Sonora just south of us because we have them during the breeding season, and they seem to, they use our riparian corridor and come up and down. They like to nest. They'll dig a hole in the side of those embankments, often behind a root mass, a mesquite tree that's being eroded out, and so that they make sneaky little nests. It's not like bank swallows or rough-winged swallows that you see them flying in and out of their hole very readily. They're hard to find, but so I have to say no. The San Pedro River, I think, has had a probable nest over the years, and so maybe we'll get them. We got the food for them. There was another question. Yes, sir. So the question was, of the 5, I'm going to paraphrase it to make it sound really good, okay? Of the 550 kinds of bees that are known to exist, as in nowhere else in the world in the San Bernardino Valley, is anybody looking at those? Is anybody studying those? And yes, the answer is yes. The reason that we know that there's that many bees is because there's a professor whose name is Robert Minkley, Dr. Robert Minkley, and he's at, he's in Rochester, New York. And he has studied bees in the San Bernardino Valley for many, many years. And so he's one of our collaborators. I tried to get him to come out and figure out what's the pollinator of that cactus. And instead, he came out and he showed me how to monitor bees and said, well, have at it, And so he taught me a little bit. So he's our collaborator. And this is kind of an ongoing work. He has plots set up and monitors what's going on out there. There's probably more than 550 kinds of bees, but the taxonomists are still looking at a lot of them and trying to figure out, what is this bee? Is this something new? So he's found a lot of new kinds of species there. Good question. Thank you. You have a question? Okay. So the question is, if you're really sick of looking at birds and you just want to look at butterflies, or if you're looking at butterflies and birds at the same time, which is a good technique, because as the birds start dwindling, as the day warms up, the butterflies start becoming active. Same with dragonflies. So it's a good thing to hinge on. The question is, when's the best time to see the butterflies? And there's sort of the 2 times. It's sort of like with the birds. There's the spring that we all know in April, which is a good time. And then I think a better time is when the monsoons kick in. And what that does is it not only greens everything up, but it makes things hatch that were waiting to just pop out of their chrysalis. And then thirdly, what it does is you get all these migrant species that are coming up from Mexico that come up with the monsoons. And so you can see things that are very rare, that literally are Mexican species that just show up occasionally in Arizona. So that would be July and August, typically. Oh, this is not Phoenix or Tucson. The monsoons bring in a little more humidity than we're used to, but temperatures in Cochise County. This is a high elevation. Sierra Vista, where I live, which is a great place to look for butterflies in the canyons, is 4,500 feet elevation, and it may get into the 90s in the daytime, but then it'll dip down to the 60s at night. So it's a pretty pleasant. It's a pleasant experience. It's not like going to Phoenix Bus Depot or something like that, And if it's too hot for you, just go up in elevation, right? Good question. Yes, sir. The question was, where's a good place to camp in Cochise County if you're visiting the refuges? and do you recommend places to eat? How do you get there? So I have these brochures. They're up on the table, so I don't think we're going to run out. I brought plenty. There's 3 different things up here, though, so grab one of each if you're interested. But the blue brochure, it has maps of how to find the refuges, and it has information about the refuges and nearby sites and stuff like that. This green brochure with the vermilion flycatcher on the front of it, it's our bird list, but it's also our mammal list, and it's also our fish list, and it's also our dragonfly list, and it's also our butterfly list. And it's also outdated because as soon as you print one of these, someone sees something new. So this is not all inclusive, but it's good through, it's pretty good. And then the last brochure is just about the refuges in Arizona. It's that map that I showed early in the presentation, and it has contact information of each of those on the back so that you can contact them. Our refuges don't have camping. Some refuges do. Ours are pretty small, and there's a lot of endemic things crammed into them, so we just don't have camping. The refuges are open during daylight hours, and you don't need to check in. It doesn't cost you anything to go to them. You just show up and wander around, but read the regulations. There's some areas that are sensitive, so we don't allow the public in there unless you contact us, and then we can make arrangements to get you into certain areas. If you're dying to see a Chiricahua leopard frog or something like that, we can help with that. As far as places to eat, the towns of Bisbee and Sierra Vista and Douglas all have good places to eat, and so what's good Mexican food to you might not be good Mexican food to me because you're from Flagstaff. But I know you used to live down there. So, I won't recommend any specific place, but there's some good places to eat down there. There are formal campgrounds. The National Forest Service has campgrounds in the Peloncillo Mountains, which are near San Bernardino Wildlife Refuge. State trust lands are lands that you can typically access. So there's a variety. Chiricahua Mountains are right there too, right? So I don't know. I don't know if there's still a good place in Agua Prieta to get shrimp. It is a little closer to the ocean than the other side of the border, but yeah. So see, that's part of the adventure. Let us know.
Any effort or attempt to enlarge the size of either of the refuges?
Well, the question is there an interest or effort to make the refuges bigger, to increase their size? And I would say, for the most part, no. The way that we're dealing with that, the way I'm dealing with that as a manager, the way the agency's dealing with it, is by working with collaborators. So, for example, Leslie Canyon Wildlife Refuge, if you grab a brochure and look at it, it talks about a 2,700 acre refuge. And that's how much the federal government owns. But the federal government also has purchased another 24,000 acres of conservation easements upstream that support, the watershed that supports Leslie Canyon. So technically, that's not a part of the wildlife refuge, but it is in the sense that we have used tax money to purchase conservation easement to prevent development and to encourage and allow a reintroduction of species and stuff like that. So that, to me, that's more of a potential win-win situation. The counties are real happy with that because, of course, these lands are still on the tax rolls, right? So someone's still paying taxes to the county, so they're real happy. Because when the federal government owns the land, we're not paying taxes. We pay this in lieu of taxes thing, but it's a little different. The landowner still owns the property. We don't have any special right to do things on that property without working in concert with the landowner. So that's really how we've dealt with it down there. Both of those properties at one time were private property. And again, it was a nature conservancy that came in the late 70s originally, and and worked with the landowners and purchased those properties. And they purchased the core property, the part that actually had the endangered species swimming around in them. And then we've worked with the landowners to help protect that watershed that supports those endangered species. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
The Yankee River, is that a groundwater supplied river with springs, or is something else supplied that?
So the question is, where does the water come from that supports the Rio Yaqui, which is, again, a huge river? And it's a variety of things. I mean, the U.S. side is springs and seeps that pop up. And there's plenty of those in the Sonora and Chihuahua side too. However, the reason those springs and seeps pop up is because of precipitation. Mostly we find out through studies that it's winter precipitation. So when we get snowfall on the Chiricahuas in the winter, it's that very snow that fell that worked its way into the ground that supports Leslie Creek and Leslie Canyon in June of the same year. It's that quick in that situation. So if we don't get a snowpack in the Chiricahua Mountains, we risk not having a flow of water in Leslie Creek. Right now we have isolated pools of water instead of a flowing creek. So that's the risky thing. San Bernardino Valley is a little different. That's more ancient water, but it still is water that originally fell as either snow or rain in the Chiricahua Mountains and in the rest of that watershed. But then it goes deep underground, and it doesn't rise again in springs on San Bernardino Refuge for between 5 and 50,000 years later. So we're not feeling the effects of the drought right now, because we're still seeing that ancient water, which tends to attenuate, so it kind of levels out the highs and the lows. No, I mean, the Sierra Madre is a huge watershed, gets a lot of rain. We get that same kind of rain that you do here, that winter rain and then the summer rains. So springs are rare, but they do help support those headwaters, and ultimately, it's a gaining river. They start sucking it out pretty quick for agriculture and municipal use, and it's having an impact. It isn't dry yet like the Colorado is. It still hits the Sea of Cortez, but there's a huge saltwater intrusion because less water is coming out and pushing the sea. I'm guessing that some people want to go home. And I'm guessing that some people want to go and eat snacks. And I'm really happy to stand up here and turn off the microphone and answer questions afterwards. So at this point, let me hold off on any other questions for now. But I will stick around. Be sure and grab brochures and stuff like that. And be sure and stick around for the snacks if you can. Thank you.